Alright, boys and girls, let's move on to our landscape painting. I'm going to do a vertical piece, starting with a rough sketch. So let me start by placing a horizon. And I'm going to place a mountain range, the beautiful sun spilling over the mountains here. Here's some rocky cliffs, just an interesting line. And then I'm moving into the foreground. So I have this plateau shape here. Let's have a cliff and a beautiful river cutting through. Here will be an outcropping of grasses and stuff. Here comes the river. The river cuts through, and as it comes closer to the foreground, it appears wider. Then I'll have some wonderful pine trees cutting into the river's edge. Now let's just do some really quick shading. If this is the sun, then the brightness of the sunset is going to spill over the mountains here and there, and then these ridges are going to be darker, and they're going to be darker the farther they get from the sun. Since the contrast needs to increase as you come forward in the picture, this plateau that is closer to me than these mountains needs to be darker so it can come forward. So I'm just scribbling in some trees here and here. And compositionally, I'm getting a good sense of how it's going to come together. So now, step 2, I want to lay this out on my watercolor paper. Now this is 300-pound rag paper. You only need to stretch rag paper because instead of a wood pulp, it has cotton pulp. If you're a beginner, don't spend the money on rag paper. Do your experimentation on wood pulp. Once you're comfortable with the medium and you're ready to move on to the more professional surface, that's when you whip out the rag paper. Now, in order to size that and get it stretched, first tear it down or cut it to the size that you want. Soak that for 10 to 15 minutes. Then put that down on some 1/4-inch plyboard and staple it. Staples about 1.5 to 2 inches apart from each other, and it will stretch itself tight as a drum. Then when the painting is finished, you simply pry up the staples using a flathead screwdriver and pliers, being really careful not to rip the paper, and Bob's your uncle. You're all done. So, to lay out your picture, follow the same steps. Place the horizon and the major elements, and you want your pencil marks to be dark enough to serve as a useful guide, but not so dark that light washes of paint will show through. Now I cleaned up my sketch a little bit and I added biscuit to the river to keep that nice and white. That way I don't have to worry about it while I'm painting. I'm going to start by just wetting down the area for the sky so I can have nice fluid washes. And this is a sunset scene, so I'm going to work in a lot of oranges and yellows. So let me just drop in some orange over here, then get into the yellow. And then I'm just going to paint right over the top of the mountain ridge. So that's all nice and wet right now. And then while I have the ability for texture, I want to do as much texturing as I can. So I'm just going to sprinkle in some water droplets here. Help those colors to move a little bit, and then you can even pick up your paper and shift it back and forth. And just let the water move the paint on its own. When that paint gets a little bit drier, use a damp brush, pick out some cloud shapes. Just like these. Okay, then I'm going to let this dry completely and move on down the picture plane. Now the sky is dry and it's a nice interesting texture, so I'm going to start this mountain range. I have a nice dark purpley brown mixed up on the brush, And see how I use the edge of the brush to lay in that upper ridge. And as I work, I'm also going to drop in some different colors to help it have a little bit more variation. For really small details, flip your brush over and scratch in those little tiny ridges. And when I start to get close to the sun, I'm going to back off with the really dark colors, switch back to the reds, and add some more orange into it. And you want to move in and fill that color in before the outline has a chance to dry. And it lightens up as I get closer to the horizon line here. And I'm going to mix in some more yellow. And continue on the way. So this process is a wet into wet painting, but I increase control by letting the background dry completely. And then I'm going to sprinkle in some more texture with the water bottle here and let this dry a second time. Alright, it's dry again, so let's push on. I'm going to start layering this color of the foliage here and spattering in the trees. So let me just wash over the whole thing here. I'll straighten up the line as I go. See how I just use a damp brush and rub it back and forth. That color is really fresh and it's going to pick right up. I'm going to do this last, but I'm going to paint this entire lower area all in one fell blow. So my first step is to protect the sky and that mountain range. And then I'm just going to start going to town, spattering in some foliage and texture here. Just get a nice puddle or two mixed up on your palette. Since I have that river protected, I can just slam this with a ton of different texture. But the key to this step is getting plenty of paint on the page. I don't want a lot of little drops, so I'm going to spritz with water and keep those blended together better like this, and just go back to town. Don't spatter just the same thing over and over again. Mix in some yellows, mix in some different blues. This is an area that works really well for using plastic syringes too. This is a blunt tip syringe. I can just suck in water or color and spray that right on the page. See how well that works. Palette knife is another thing you can use, scratch in some different textures. See, you're trying to manipulate the paper and paint in a way that gives you really cool effects, but you're just enabling the painting to paint itself. Then I think I'm also going to salt this. Just salt into the wet paint, let that dry completely. You're going to see some cool textured effects. Now this is dry, so I'm going to pry up that loose salt. And if I focus in, you can really see that awesome texture that the salt and stamping and flinging all give you. So let's add the dark colors on these banks. I just want to leave a little ridge so it'll look like some light coming through. And when the watercolor is wet, it's going to mix itself right on the page. Using a flat brush is not only faster, it helps you to focus on putting down the large shapes and then backing off without picking at it too much. Details can be done with round brushes at the end, but the brunt of the work needs to be a flat brush. I'm going to drop in some trees over here using the edge of the brush. These trees back in here are more orangey because they're closer to the light. And then as it moves forward, they're going to go darker and greener. Let me add some darks to the bank while the river is protected. Same thing for the river's edge on this side. Spray the edge. The water is doing all the work for me and carrying the paint up into interesting, natural looking patterns. I'm going to put something underneath it so it will dry flat. I'll come back to this when it's dry again. Now I've removed the biscuit from the river so you can see that that's stayed nice and white. So now I'm going to move on to this hill in the foreground. So I want this to stand apart from this. In order for that to happen, I'm going to need to lighten up this tone a little bit. So just use a damp flat brush, lift up some of that color, and then we'll have to let that dry again. So while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to go into the river a little bit. The shadows on the river are pretty purple. Use a flat brush on the side to lay in some very basic patterns that could indicate shadows of trees on the moving river. I'm going to go right over the trees, because remember I'm going to paint those again anyway. Give it a little water, break up that pattern, tilt the board side to side, and just encourage that to paint itself a little bit more. Then back in here, up in here, it's more golden. So I'm just looking for the largest shapes and painting them in as shapes. I'm going to try some salt over the top here. Then I just have to let that dry. Now everything is dry, so I'm going to drop in this foreground hill. I'm just going to start to really carefully drop in an interesting tree line here, just the way I did for the mountains. And you've seen this before. Just use the side of the flat brush, make it interesting. And then before this has a chance to dry, I'm going to drag down. Notice how when I'm painting flat areas, I still let the color puddle up. That, combined with using several different colors to make up a flat tone, help to create more interesting varieties and more eye-catching color planes. Let's move down into the trees now. I'm waiting for that to dry. This is how you can make an easy pine tree. You just rock back and forth with a big flat brush, or you can suck up color in your syringe and squirt that right on the page. Then once the color is on the page, you can drop in different colors and you can scrape the pattern through using the brush handle. See down at the bottom, we can just sprinkle in some more darks. And then I'm going to scrabble over the top with the brush handle like this. Then you can tip the board, remove those big blobs, and some yellow to make some of these greens a little bit different. I'll just rock this back and forth a little bit. Let those colors do their thing. Now I'm at the point again where I need to let this dry, and so I'll come back to it in about 20 minutes. Alright, here's the finished landscape. Here's the bottom edge and the upper edge. So it's a fairly straightforward process. Just remember, keep your colors lively, mix in multiple colors to keep it from being flat, always texturize, work from the back to the front. Things should go pretty well for you. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you watch again in the future when we'll be learning more about painting and drawing.